Hello, I'm Arthur Brandwood, and welcome to this September edition of our live webinar series, where today I'm going to be talking about taking a 510K down under, or using US and Canadian and Japanese approvals for the means of TGA registration. Those of you who are regulars in our webinar series will know we did touch on this topic a couple of months back. This particular webinar is a live update, if you like, given the TGA have now finally announced their policies and practices for accepting other than CE marks for registration. So before we begin, I just point out that this is a live webinar and we do a question and answers at the end. If you, on your control panel, press the Q&A button, you'll find that you can type in a question. I'll be able to see that here, and we'll go to questions at the end of the webinar. So shall we begin? Firstly, I just want to ask a simple question. What's really important in medical device regulation? I think we all agree that these are the things that matter. We all agree that the whole design, production, management of a medical device life cycle is risk-based. It needs to be managed by ISO 14971 risk agreement management. We all agree that quality systems are important and that they should control both design and production. We all agree that devices should be tested, and that that design verification testing generally is done according to consensus standards, both product standards and horizontal standards such as electrical and biological safety. We all agree that clinical evidence is important and that clinical evidence supports the labeling of indications for use. And finally, that regulation is a whole of life cycle. In other words, that not just pre-market review, not just testing, not just pre-market clinical evidence, but the post-market follow-up is very much part of the picture. This is the same in every jurisdiction. All regulators, I think, would say that their regulatory systems do this, that require this. But how do they manage it? How do they actually do all of these things? And it really comes down to a question of resources. Here's a photograph taken about a year ago in Beijing, China, in a training course I was participating in, teaching ISO 10993 risk assessment to the reviewers in the Center for Medical Device Evaluation of the Beijing CFDA, what used to be the CFDA. And you can see there's more than 100 reviewers in that room. Many of them are new in the agency. The China agency is adding to review staff to cope with the workload of doing all of this assessment. And that's a challenge for all regulators. Let's just look at the kind of resources that are used by regulators. The big one, of course, is the US FDA, Center for Devices and Radiological Health, has got approximately 1,500 people in this. I don't know what the actual number is today, but it's of that sort of order. 1,500 reviewers and experts and auditors dedicated to regulation of medical devices in the United States. If you go to Europe, of course, it's a third-party system there. There are a range of notified bodies, and then each separate nation state has its own competent authority. And if you add all the people in all of those together and say take about the top 10 notified bodies, which are the bulk of the market, 95% or something, plus the competent authorities, you'll come up with about 5,000 people. So there's a significant resource in Europe. Here in Australia, the situation's a little different. The TGA is an internationally recognized agency, but it does struggle with size. In Australia, the Therapeutic Goods Administration has probably got about 100 people, maybe a few more now, dedicated to regulation of medical devices. And here's the challenge of a smaller agency. The Australian Register for Therapeutic Goods has got about 40,000, more than 40,000 entries on it, probably covering several 100,000, if not 1 million, different product lines. Australia groups its registrations into kinds of similar devices, about 40,000 independent registrations, 100 people. There is no way that we can be looking at each and every one of those and assessing and reviewing each and every application. and that's the Therapeutic Goods Administration there. That large building has 100 medical device people in it. The rest of the POC in there are dedicated to other aspects of regulation, including medicines and biologicals and complementary medicines. So how does TGA do it? And the answer is in the use of the regulatory model and in harmonization. The regulatory model in Australia is that which is based on the Global Harmonization Task Force model. It contains the elements you'll all be very familiar with of essential requirements, use of consensus standards as a means of compliance, a rules-based risk classification, and regulatory intervention which is based on that risk, and then post-market vigilance. Now that system of regulation is of course based on the European, and Australia has essentially adopted the European into its own regulatory system, as have some other jurisdictions, including most notably Canada. Australia and Canada have essentially very similar regulatory systems to those in Europe. And so what does that mean? It means that there is equivalence in regulation. Here's a table just showing you the corresponding sections of the European Medical Device Directives and the Australian Therapeutic Goods Medical Devices Regulations, where there is one-to-one correspondence between all the annexes in the directives. In other words, TGA applies exactly the same requirements for review and assessment here in Australia as are done in Europe under the current MDD. I know that Europe's changing to the MDR, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. So what are the paths to market in Australia, therefore? And the simple answer is you either have to have a TGA conformity assessment. TGA acts as a conformity assessment body, it acts in the same way as a notified body in Australia. It's also the competent authority. Or because of the equivalence of regulatory systems and requirements and assessment processes, TGA also accepts the European CE mark. So you can bring either a TGA conformity assessment certificate or you can bring a CE certificate. And based on either of those, you can go onto the register and achieve a registration in Australia and then go to the Australian market. Pretty simple sort of approach. Here's the actual processes. On the left are the different risk classes, going from class 1 at the bottom all the way up to the highest risk class 3 devices which contain integral medicines or materials of animal origin. The class 1 devices still have to be registered, but that's done by an online notification process. You simply notify through an e-submission on the TGA e-business web portal, and you have your registration the following day. The database updates overnight. For the class 3 high-risk devices with medicines or animal origin materials, you are required to submit a TGA conformity assessment. For all of the others, you can also submit a TGA conformity assessment, but you can also bring a CE certificate, present that CE certificate to TGA, and then go to the register. For the medium to high risk devices, TGA will do what's called a mandatory application audit, which means they will call in some of the technical file information. Specifically, they're going to be looking at the labeling claims and the clinical evidence as the key pieces of information they'll want to review before they allow the registration. For the medium low risk devices, the 1SMs and the 2As and most 2Bs, those audits are not mandatory. TGA will do them from time to time where they have a particular concern, but most of those devices go straight onto the register based on the certificate alone. That means that in Australia, currently, about 95% of medical device approvals that require review are based on the CE mark alone. But Europe is changing. Because of these two well-known cases of the PIP implant, which was a regulatory fraud, and the ASR hip, which raised questions about adequacy of clinical information, not just these, a number of other well-known examples of challenges to the regulatory system with higher risk devices. Europe has decided that they need to move to a new regulatory system where there is more governance, more centralized control, hence a medical device regulation control from the European Commission, and much more requirement for clinical data. And Specifically, that means increased safety and performance requirements. The essential principles have been revised and made more stringent. The classifications have been updated to place more devices into class 3. That essentially means more data is now going to be required. Clinical evaluation requirements are strengthened, and the new scrutiny process means stricter reviews, and post-market surveillance and the transparency through the UDAMED database means continuous vigilance. So Europe is getting harder. What hasn't changed in Europe is the basic regulatory model. All those things we talked about before, essential requirements, risk-based review, and so on, are still there. The fundamental regulatory model is unchanged. So TGA can continue to accept CE certificates, but manufacturers are going to find them harder to get, at least in the near future, while Europe adjusts and makes its transition to the medical device regulations. And we're seeing the reports coming out of Europe of extended review times, delays in getting the attention of notified bodies, shifting over. And here's an example of that. Neil McAleenan from the Irish Competent Authority speaking in China last year, talking about the challenges that exist at the moment in simply redesignating the notified bodies. At the moment, you cannot be assessed against the medical device regulation because no notified bodies have yet been approved to do so. They've not been designated, and that process is still continuing. The whole thing was estimated to take about 18 months, and we're coming towards the end of that now. So things are taking their time in Europe. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic in the United States, things are improving. And here's the FDA representative in China speaking at the same conference saying that review times are coming down. It's easier to get an approval in the United States now. While all this has been going on, reviews have been taking place here in Australia as well as to how we rely upon international approvals. This review of medicines and medical devices regulation, so-called Sansom report, which handed down its medical device section in 2015, talked about streamlining regulatory processes through harmonization, supporting innovation and strengthening post-market, the things I've been talking about, and had a number of recommendations. I'm not going to talk about all of that, but I do want to talk about the one specific one that said TGA should look to utilize approvals from other comparable authorities than just CE. And TGA has been diligent in exploring how to do that. In May last year, May 2017, they published a consultation paper on comparable overseas regulators, and put that out for public comment. That paper raised a number of questions. It talked about how TGA might do this. They might look at accepting information from other regulators. They may also look at working together with other regulators, although that's not really been talked about in detail. TGA already works together with other drug regulators on shared reviews. They're not yet doing that in any depth with medical device reviews, although they are using information from other reviews, and we'll talk about how that works. But particularly in this consultation, the question was, how do we assess the comparability of overseas regulators, and where there are differences, how do you bridge the gap between them and what TGA requires? And in more detail, they talked about these things. The comparability really is about having similar objectives for regulation, similar frameworks, and what TGA called operational alignment. In other words, that the other regulator does the same things, that it does scientific and engineering pre-market reviews, which are evidence-based, that the other regulator does quality systems reviews that are based around ISO 135 or equivalent standards, that there is a whole of life cycle post-market process, and it's all risk-based. They focus particularly on IMDRF members. TGA, of course, is a member of the IMDRF. It's a member of the management committee, where there is a commitment to harmonization between those jurisdictions and existing open communication channels with those regulators, so easy to talk to the other regulator. A full life cycle approach. They wanted agencies who not just pre-market but also did the whole risk-based thing right through to post-market review to end of life, and that there had to be capacity and process underlying the expertise of the other regulator. These were the criteria that TGA believed were important in accepting evidence from other international regulators. And at the end of the consultation, TGA then went away and considered the feedback, and finally, just last month, just a few weeks ago, came out with this document, the TGA policy and use of overseas evidence, and how this is done. The necessary regulations are already in place for TGA to accept evidence from other regulators that TGA deemed to be acceptable, so there's no further regulatory change required. Now it's a matter of implementing it, and here's the TGA policy on how they're going to do that. And remember this slide from before, the current TGA processes where the bulk of devices come through a CE certificate. Now we've got a slightly different arrangement. So we still have the possibility to bring CE. That's not changed. You can still bring CE, and probably most manufacturers will who have got existing CE. But given the challenges of getting a new CE in the next couple of years, it's likely that some manufacturers will look to alternate pathways. And the CE is considered by TGA as both a product and a quality system assessment. You are required to get a CE. You really have to have an ISO 13485 certificate, although it's not a mandatory standard. There are very few examples of manufacturers who achieve a CE without an ISO 13485 certificate or some other quality systems assessment. TGA believes that you need both of those things, both the product and the quality system design and manufacturing assessment. So they said, okay, when we're looking at other regulators, we want to see both of those elements. So here's how it's going to work. For the product assessment, if from the United States, TGA will accept either evidence of a PMA approval or evidence of a 510K or a de novo approval in the form of the summaries from those approvals. In other words, you need to produce the summary to TGA. Notice that this is risk class based. So if you have a class 3 or an active implantable device as classified in Australia, then TGA will only accept a PMA. If you have a class 2B or a 2A, then they will accept a 510K or a de novo. For lowest risk class 1 sterile or measurement, there is no requirement for a product assessment. In Canada, if you have a Canadian license, you can also bring a Canadian license as evidence, and those line up quite nicely because there's essentially the same classification systems. There are a few differences between Canadian and Australian classifications, so the corresponding license will be acceptable as evidence of a product assessment by Health Canada. And from Japan, high-risk devices will need a shonin, which has been assessed by the ministry. Medium and lower-risk devices, 2Bs and 2As, can come with an INSHO that's been assessed by a third party, the product certificates. And then on top, the quality system certificate, and here's the interesting part, TGA has said that really means a medical device single audit program certificate. So here we have another regulator following from Canada and saying MDSAP certificate is really the way to go for demonstrating quality systems compliance for international regulators coming into Australia. They will also accept a Japanese QMS certificate. Of course, the United States FDA does not issue quality system certification. It only issues audit reports, and it doesn't necessarily audit every year. They have a risk-based system in the US. So TGA has decided that it can't accept evidence of US FDA audit. It needs to be MDSAP or Japan Quality System Certificate. So that's how it works. You can bring any of those things and then achieve a registration. There will still be an application audit. MDSAP audit, by the way, is required for class 1 sterile or measurement. You simply need, it's no product assessment. You simply need to bring an MDSAP certificate that covers either the scope of sterilization or the scope of calibration for those products. TGA is not interested in doing a product review for those low-risk products. There will still be an application audit. And that application audit is likely to focus on clinical evidence, as is currently the case. And the primary reason for that is that not all of these overseas regulators delve into clinical evidence in the same way that TGA does. TGA has always been heavily reliant on clinical evidence reviews, have always, as an agency, considered that to be the central piece of the evidence supporting compliance of the device, and that's not changed. And certainly that's going to be a little challenging for manufacturers coming from the US who've got a 510K, where of course the premise of a 510K submission is that you are making a comparison with a predicate device that has established clinical safety and performance. So you are showing functional equivalence and design and safety equivalence with another device, and relying on that other device's clinical record to infer clinical performance in your device. Most 510Ks still do not have clinical evidence, although that's rising, about 15% plus now. FDA requires clinical evidence. But in the absence of that, TGA will expect to see a separate clinical evaluation report to TGA's requirements. So expect to see, if you bring a device through this pathway, the TGA will be calling in your clinical evidence. Now, there are some challenges to this process, which I've alluded to already. Here's the slide again. The first thing is the obvious one of classification. Many class 3 devices in Europe or Australia are not required to have PMAs. In the United States, the PMA is a much more narrowly focused approval pathway to a much smaller range of devices. So if you are a medical device that is class 3 or active implant, but is qualified in the United States by means of a 510K clearance, then you will not be able to use this pathway based on American evidence, because a 510K or de novo is not generally going to be acceptable for a class 3 or active implantable medical device. The separate, as I've already said, is that clinical evidence is not available for the 510K. So they are the two primary challenges. Otherwise, this is a very welcome opening up of acceptability for a range of other international evidence. I put this slide in to make a point that this is the mapping of the documentation that underpins a medical device regulatory assessment. This is the evidence of compliance. On the left is a typical European or Australian technical file, which contains 4 elements: some administrative stuff in white, some specific regulatory documents for Europe and Australia and Canada, declarations of conformity, essential principles checklist, things like that. And then the design history file, which is all the design verification and clinical validation. So plans, risk management file, design specs, all the evidence and so on. And that's the design history file. And then the production records, the device master record, all the process SOPs, the production specifications and so on. The DHF is generally the thing that gets reviewed in pre-market review when the regulator looks at the evidence for testing and clinical evaluation. The DMR is generally something that's done at factory inspection through quality systems audit. That's the full body of evidence which will be acceptable in Europe, in Australia, and it's the same evidence that will be reviewed in China or Japan or any other significant jurisdiction. In the United States, that body of evidence would be very much what would be reviewed in a PMA. For a 510K, there's a slightly different system where there's an extract from the evidence. Principally, there are some other things, including the 510K summary and the substantial equivalence discussion, but there will be a summary of the risk assessment. There will be design information, the product description specifications, plus all of the engineering verification reports, and in some cases the clinical validation will also go to the regulator. Point of this slide is really there's very broad agreement between all regulators on what information is expected to be held by a manufacturer. As I started at the beginning, they all agree on risk assessment, they all agree on pre-market review, they all agree on verification testing against consensus standards. Most regulators will use the same standards around the world. FDA recognizes pretty much similar standards, not as wide a range, but recognizes similar standards to those that are recognized in Europe, all based around the ISO and EN standards group. Even China, although China tends to have a lot more mandatory individual standards, but it's still all standards based. They're all doing it in a risk management framework. They're all looking for clinical evaluation. So again, regulators are looking at the same information. It is not about the information that the manufacturer holds. The issue about to make harmonization work is how do the regulators do their reviews? How do they manage the process? And so I come to what are the challenges to harmonization? And the first one is quality systems. Differences in quality system requirements between regulators produce the inefficiency of multiple audits. I once heard it said that Medtronic, the world's largest medical device company, gets audited about once every 18 days. Somebody comes to audit a Medtronic plant. It's probably more frequently than that. That's a highly inefficient burden on larger regulators, on larger manufacturers. If manufacturers are going to multiple markets, they will expect to receive audit visits from multiple regulators. Now, that's being addressed through the Medical Device Single Audit Program, through these 5 IMDRF members, the 5 participants in MDSAP, where the principle is one audit done by any of the approved MDSAP assessors of any of the regulators, and then that audit will be recognized by all of the others. That's a very welcome step forward. It has its challenges. It's particularly useful for the large multinationals because they have one single audit. It is, however, a much bigger audit because it's dealing with not just the overall quality systems requirements, but it is looking for evidence of regulatory compliance in all of the markets supplied by the manufacturer. So the audits are longer, with more audit staff, a larger audit team, and correspondingly more expensive, but you do it once. And certainly MDSAP is now starting to take off. The enrollment is going up very rapidly. Secondly, technical standards. One of the differences is the challenge of national variants on standards. If you look at the United States FDA website, you will see that FDA recognizes a wide range of standards from a wide range of jurisdictions, not just US standards. There are even some Australian standards which are there on the FDA website, recognized by FDA. However, FDA does like to tweak their recognition. They will recognize standards sometimes in part. They will exclude certain clauses. They will modify certain clauses. They will introduce national variants. And that often then results in duplicate testing because manufacturers have to retest to local requirements in different jurisdictions. That's particularly true in a good example being something like biocompatibility, where Japan and China have some different test protocols compared to the ones that are used in the rest of the world. And so manufacturers end up sometimes repeating biological safety testing for those jurisdictions. That's an inefficiency, and it can only be resolved by achieving greater consensus on the technical requirements in the standards. We see that happening in China as a good example. I gave this whole presentation in China last week, and hence I'm using some Chinese examples. One of the things that's happening in China started a couple of years ago now, a program of review or development of 500 new standards in 5 years. China is actually ahead on that. They're well into that program, and after 2 years they've done something like 300, and I think they've now added a couple more 100 standards to the target. But China does tend to have a whole lot of local industry standards specific to certain devices which are not found in the rest of the world, and furthermore a lot of them are mandatory. So that creates a problem of again, requirement for duplicate testing in China, which is particularly challenging, although credit to the China FDA and the China National Standards Body that they are updating this body of standards, and this 500 includes a lot of revisions to bring them up to date and in alignment with current ISO versions, including, I think, fairly shortly, finally going to the 3rd edition of IEC 60601. Third difference is in acceptability of clinical data. The most regulators will say to you, yes, we will accept clinical data from anywhere in the world, providing that the data are collected under good clinical practice that's equivalent to theirs. that actually generally means compliance with ISO 14155, and most regulatory systems require a code of GCP that either is ISO 14155 or is a national requirement that's quite closely aligned, but also that the data, the trial data, are relevant to the target jurisdiction, both in terms of the population addressed and in terms of the local clinical practice. In other words, if the international data are gathered in one jurisdiction, are the population, patient population in terms of ethnicity, racial differences, genetics, and so on, equivalent to the population in the target market, and is the practice of medicine equivalent, so are the data comparable? And in most cases that's true, but regulators are very conservative in their approach. The United States FDA, being a very good example, is quite conservative and usually wants to see clinical data at least partially supported by trials from the United States. China is the same, although the State Administration for Market Regulation in China, in Circular 13 this year, brought out a policy for accepting more international clinical data, not requiring trials to be conducted in China necessarily, but to use international data, subject to those data, again, being under China GCP, being comparable to China, and having been used in support of a regulatory submission in the international market. So a limited approach in China, but getting there. In China last week at the International Medical Device Regulatory Forum, I was lucky enough to be present at a presentation from the Japanese authorities that talked about what Japan is doing in terms of acceptance of international clinical data, and looking at the trend in Japan, where a few years ago at least 30% of device approvals in Japan required a clinical trial to be done in Japan. That number's down to the order of 10% now, that 90% of high-risk medical devices in Japan are now approved based on clinical trials conducted internationally and not required to be conducted in Japan. So that regulator is very much on top of that now and accepting international data. And certainly here in Australia, TGA very rarely requires trials to be done here in Australia. They will accept international data quite readily. And the final one that's the most difficult of all, and that is classification. And I leave you with this thought, that the biggest challenge to achieving true harmonization is that different regulators are still using different risk class systems, which means that devices in one jurisdiction may be high risk and they may be medium risk in another. And that means that the level of review is different, that sometimes the approaches to review are different, and therefore difficult for regulators to share information because the fundamental approach has been different. And so the IMDRF is meeting this week in Beijing. China is currently the chair, and I leave this as a thought for them. If you're listening, anybody from IMDRF, here's some homework. Let's see if we can align device classifications more fully around the world. I know that's challenging in that we've got two different models. We have the rules-based system that's applied in Europe and Canada, Australia, and other GHTF-like jurisdictions, and then we have the catalog approaches in the United States and China and Taiwan and Korea and a number of others who all derive their classification systems fundamentally from the US FDA, and those two different approaches still need to be reconciled, and I know that's not an easy job, but there's some homework for them. So at the end of that, it's now time for some questions and answers. And I have a question here from Lewis, who asks, can an ISO 13485 be used with a 510K? And the answer is only if it's done through an MDSAP. TGA have been quite specific on that. It's interesting that they currently accept ISO 13485 certificates to support IVD registrations, but for medical devices, they've been quite clear that if you're going to do this, bringing Japanese or Canadian or US evidence, that it has to be prepared with an MDSAP audit. And the argument, I did query this for TGA, and the argument is that that's something, that type of audit is one they're familiar with, that's being done by their regulatory partners. They understand the level of scrutiny that's involved in an MDSAP audit, and it is specifically tuned to looking at regulatory compliance. MDSAP audits, as part of the scope, audit not just the quality system design and production activities, but they specifically look for evidence that the manufacturer's quality system addresses and controls regulatory compliance in all of the MDSAP markets that they supply. So the answer, Lewis, is it's still got to be an MDSAP. They won't take on a 13485 certificate on its own. Romad asks, how will TGA accept system or procedure packs with a 510K or a PMA? Good question. I don't know the answer to that, but I suspect the answer is they would find it very difficult to do so, because procedure packs and systems in the United States do not require separate registration generally. The way it works in the US is that providing all the components of a procedure pack are separately approved, either through 510 clearance or PMA, then you generally don't need to have a separate approval or clearance for the procedure pack. So I don't think that evidence is going to exist. That's my speculation, Romad. I just say I'm not really sure, but that's probably the way that's going to work. So, Cassie says, when will the new policy document for accepting overseas evidence be fully implemented in Australia? Is there a date for this? The answer is now. It's already in place. It's been published. TGA is accepting applications based on this overseas evidence. So they're doing it already. Now, I should add that TGA have informally for some years abridged direct conformity assessment. So if you go to TGA for a full conformity assessment, they have for some years and been prepared to look at what evidence you've already got, usually backing a CE, but sometimes other, and taken that into account to do a simpler or reduced assessment on the conformity assessment review. So this is here now. This process will allow you to go and apply directly for a registration for most medium to medium high risk devices. But if you still are going to have to go through a TGA conformity assessment, if you have a class 3 with a medicine, if you have a class 3 with an animal origin component in it, then you can use these overseas evidence in the same way. So TGA has also said, as part of this, that in addition to being able to register most devices directly based on US, Japanese, or Canadian evidence, if you're going through a full conformity assessment pathway in Australia because it's a very high-risk device, and you have a US 510K approval or a PMA, you have a Japanese license or a Canadian license, you can bring evidence of those reviews, and TGA will take that into account in order to shorten their review for the conformity assessment. Sometimes they'll dig deeper. They'll say, if you're available, if you are able to share with TGA the overseas inspection reports, the overseas review correspondence, then that can be used in support of your conformity assessment and allow TGA to abridge the process. Now, Edis is asking, what is the TGA equivalent to pre-submission clarification? So I think your question is around, does the TGA do a pre-submission process? And the answer is, well, the TGA has a pre-submission process. Like in the United States and Japan and China, all of these regulators have a process where you can arrange to meet with the regulator for a pre-submission discussion prior to making a formal regulatory application. And TGA is no different. It has a formal process to do that. There is a fairly straightforward application form. You need to provide information about the device its intended use, what it is you intend to claim for it in the Australian market, what kind of evidence you're bringing forward, and then what questions you want to clarify in terms of classification, in terms of necessary data. TGA will provide you feedback on things like clinical trial protocols. That's if you are going for a full conformity assessment review. So there is a full pre-submission process there, and it works very smoothly, and TGA are very helpful. In my experience in doing pre-submissions with TGA, is the agency is extraordinarily helpful in providing feedback, in bringing their own experts to the table and discussing how you might bring higher risk devices particularly, but any device that needs to go through a TGA conformity assessment. TGA generally doesn't do pre-submissions for registration applications that are just coming in based on the overseas certificates. That again is simply a matter of resources. With many thousands of entries on the register, and basically when they're allowing a registration based on an overseas certificate, they are not looking again in most cases at the review. They are simply looking at that somebody else has done a review and there's evidence in the form of an international license or certificate, and if that's there, then that's the end of the matter, and TGA is not going to enter into a pre-submission in those cases, in most cases, unless you have a problem such as irresolvable differences around clinical evidence where you may be able to talk to the agency. Now Pablo asks, what would be the case with a Class 1 exempt device in the United States if you're bringing to Australia? And if you later bring the device to Australia, can you run a trial to support clinical claims in the US? If we later on run a trial to support clinical claims in the US, can we bring the data to Australia? It's a slightly complex question there, Pablo. I think you're talking about something that's maybe a Class 1 exempt in the United States, but maybe requires to have a registration here in Australia. If it's a Class 1 in Australia, of course, it's a notification. You'd still have to have the evidence supporting your claims, but there's no review. If it's a Class 2A or 2B, for example, and some devices are exempt in the US, a small number, but would be Class 2A or 2B in Australia and require some kind of conformity assessment certification, then in that case, you're not going to be able to rely on US evidence because there isn't any. You can your clinical data, simply that depends on what the trial is. Certainly if you've done a US trial for any purpose, as long as it's been done under GCP and has an appropriate protocol, then those data could be brought to Australia or to another regulator to seek support for an Australian approval. And Pablo's just clarified that we are talking about a device that's Class 1 exempt in the US and 2A in Australia. So yes, you could do that. You could bring the US clinical data in support of your Australian submission. In the case of a device that's Class 1 exempt in the US, you are not going to be able to bring any US evidence. You will need to find some other evidence, either going direct to TGA for conformity assessment or bringing a CE or a Canadian license or whatever. Another question from Romit. Does FDA give 510K approval to Class 3 medical devices? If so, does this mean the TGA will only accept Class 3 devices which have undergone PMA? You're absolutely right, Romit. That's the case, that a number of devices, quite a range of Class 3 devices in Australia, will be subject only to 510K clearance in the United States. Quite a number of orthopedic implants, for example, will be subject to orthopedic joint implants will be subject to 510K in the United States, whereas they require a Class 3 approval here in Australia. In those cases, you will not be able to bring the evidence from the US because the TGA requires a PMA approval to support a Class 3 device registration in Australia if you're going to rely on US evidence. So the answer is yes. TGA will only accept Class 3 devices which have undergone a PMA. And that's going to be one of the challenges, and hence my point about needing to really try and get the classifications aligned. So I think that's the last of the questions. Thank you for your attention. Certainly, this is a very welcome and a big step forward, an exciting step forward for Australia. It's certainly raised a lot of interest in other regulators. TGA has taken a very large step forward towards international harmonization here. It's not been done by any other regulator, and I think they really are to be applauded for what they've done here. It makes it much easier for international manufacturers to gain local approval here in Australia. It also makes it much easier for Australian domestic developers who sometimes go to international markets first simply because of the market size here. A lot of Australian developers will seek a US approval first. This is going to provide a rapid alternative to then getting a local approval by TGA based on that US approval without having to go through a full conformity assessment in Australia. So it's going to save a lot of time and effort, providing, of course, that there's an MDSAP certificate in place, and that may be the challenge. But I look forward to seeing you again next time. Meanwhile, if you've enjoyed this webinar, do keep an eye on our website. You can follow me on Twitter, on LinkedIn. The webinars will be recorded, and the slides and the recording will be available on our website and on the Brandwood Biomedical YouTube channel. So catch up, have a look at all the other webinars that are up there. There's quite a library, and feel free to download and review them yourself. But meanwhile,